Thanks.
Do we have a topic for next one? We do. Yeah. If you want to hear the topics for next month, stay tuned until the end of this presentation. Yes. So don't leave early unless you have class. You'll get emails. Yeah, then you'll get emails about.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. My name is Aiden. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences program. My lab is just 3 floors upstairs, so it's very easy to get here. And yeah, I'm going to talk about the research that I do and give an example of some work that will hopefully be published very soon, looking at climate change in New England. But just as a very quick overview, our lab group, we are a lab group that does paleolimnology, which is the study of old lakes. And specifically, we're interested in addressing questions about past climate and environmental change by analyzing lake sediments. And hopefully you'll get a sense for what that looks like through this presentation. So the time period that I'm interested in for this whole project that I'm going to talk about today is the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. I don't know how many of you know too much about like the geologic timescale, but essentially what we're looking at is like the last 25 to 10,000 years ago. So this is like at the end of the last ice age, like when there were big ice sheets over this part of Illinois that formed Lake Michigan. And what you're looking at here is some data from Greenland. And all you really need to know is that higher values indicate warmer temperatures in Greenland and lower values indicate colder temperatures. And what we're looking at, as you can see, like, there's some pretty large fluctuations as we were coming out of the ice age. So like this period right around here is what's called the last glacial maximum. And then there's like a long-term warming trend that kind of culminates at the Holocene around 11,700 years ago, where the climate state sort of looked a lot more like it does today, at least pre-industrial climate. And as you can see, this PHT, which is Pleistocene-Holocene transition, is this time period where there was really rapid warming in the North Atlantic region. And that was all associated, just the very quick version is that was associated with changes in ocean circulation in the Atlantic Ocean. So if anyone here is familiar with the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, you maybe have seen it in the news. It's the ocean circulation that distributes heat along much of the North Atlantic region. It's featured in the Day After Tomorrow movie. When that shuts down, like Europe gets really cold. And that's essentially what happened during this Younger Dryas time period. But anyways, we're looking at this period of abrupt climate change in the Northeast. So in New England, the big takeaway here is that there were, at this transition, there were really large changes in the landscape that we know from looking at pollen in lake sediments. So this is a compilation study that looked at pollen in a bunch of different lakes and tried to model where the vegetation was. And what they found is that you went from either tundra or spruce forest into like deciduous forest, which a lot of people would interpret it as indicating warming climate. But it remains unclear how much warming actually took place to drive these large ecosystem changes in the Northeast. Yeah.
How abrupt is an abrupt transition?
So here we're looking at something like a century or less for the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. Yeah, so geologically speaking, it's instant. Yeah. And then there have been some efforts to reconstruct the temperatures that coincide with these vegetation changes, but they come from pollen, which is kind of circular because you're reconstructing the temperature change and the environmental change using the same thing. So we're going to be using an independent, what we call proxy or indicator of past temperature to try to get an independent constraint on how much warming there was and also how quickly it took place. So these freaky looking bugs are called chironomids. They are a large class of flies, and the larvae live at the bottom of lakes. And as they go through their different molting stages where they molt from little larvae into adults and then emerge out of the lake, they shed their head capsules, which are basically exoskeletons around their head made out of chitin. And as you can see, they have a lot of different like morphologies, like the different species, they look different. And if you take lake sediment and just like put a bunch of chemicals into it to kill off all the organic matter. These fossils are like super abundant. Like they're one of the most abundant things you'll find in lake mud. And it turns out that the different species are sensitive to summer air temperature. The exact mechanism is still kind of disputed, but the distributions in the modern environment and their relationship to temperature are very strong. So all you're looking at here is just a bunch of different species, and then the black dot shows their temperature optimum, because the optimum or the temperatures are on the x-axis, and then that range sort of shows like what they can tolerate. So if you see a species that plots way down here in a lake sediment sample, you probably have an indication that the climate was pretty warm. So I was going to quickly walk you through the workflow that I use in order to generate estimates of temperature using these bugs, with this general idea that these species are sensitive to air temperature. So first thing we do is we sample a sediment core. So here are two pictures of sediment cores that we imaged in our lab upstairs. The one on the left is from Maine, and the one on the right is from New Hampshire, and this is one of the cores that I'll show you data from. And then we do a lab pretreatment, so we treat it with chemicals, and then I manually pick out these head capsules under the microscope and put them onto a microscope slide. That is the most time-consuming step of this whole process. Then I identify them under the microscope. So here's a picture of one of the ones I took. Then we use modern analogs, or they're called training sets, to reconstruct summer air temperature. So basically, as you can see, there's a bunch of dots on these maps. These are lakes where people have gone out and recorded modern climate data, and then looked at the community of chironomids that live in the lake in the modern time, and then compiled them into these massive spreadsheets, essentially, that have all the different chironomids that live in the lake and the climate conditions. And there's a bunch of different statistical techniques we can use to assess which modern analogs are the best examples or the closest examples to what the chironomids look back in time. And then we can use that to estimate temperature. So it's a little more complicated than that, but I don't want to spend like 10 minutes explaining it. So I'm just going to quickly show you some data that we generated with this technique to show some of the interesting findings that we can get from this work. So here what you're looking at is two records that I recently developed from central New Hampshire. So the red curve is the one from Smith Pond, and then the blue curve is from Sky Pond. Sky Pond is the core that I just showed you. And so now we're looking at time on the y-axis. You can see it's older at the bottom and younger at the top. And then that black line is the same thing, same time as this sort of little red box I drew here, the very rapid, less than 100-year warming that was observed in Greenland because of the changes to ocean circulation. And what we can see here is that we also see evidence of warming here. So it warms about 4 to 5 degrees Celsius between 12,700 and like 10,000 or 11,000 years ago. But interestingly, here the warming takes place much more gradually. In New England, it took about 1,500 years to go from the coldest to the warmest temperatures in this sort of brief time period. But that's really different from Greenland, and it turns out it's also very different from Europe. This is kind of the first study of its kind to demonstrate that the timing of warming was fundamentally different in New England than it was in Greenland and Europe, even though the mechanism that's invoked for these climate changes is ostensibly the same. So that's kind of cool. I didn't really get into it at all, but we have really, it's hard to date sediment cores, but we've done the best that we can, and we feel pretty confident about the sequence of events here. But I can save that for later maybe. And just as a fun fact, I have a collaborator who uses a completely different technique where they use organic geochemistry to measure these weird molecules called GDGTs, which are also temperature sensitive. And so that's the orange curve. And these are two records from the same sediments at that Sky Pond site. And it's just pretty cool. They look very similar, which is rare in our field. So this is pretty awesome. Yeah, so that's like the 8-minute version of what I've been doing for like the last 3 years. These are the takeaways. One is general, that we can use lake sediments to understand past changes to climate and environment. And then this ultra fast snapshot shows you that we've discovered some interesting things about summer temperature change during the end of the last glacial period in New England. Yeah, so that's it. Yeah.
I know I'm not the boss of the, hi everyone, Sarah, I'm co-director of Center for Water. I'm not the boss of Wildcats in Water, but can we do Q&A first? No? Okay. Okay. I would like you to, and then I'll open it up to other people. I mean, the implications of fast climate change, like super fast, in a
Mhm.
geological instant, I think was your words.
Yeah.
Versus slow climate change over 1,500 years. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. So it's tricky because like there's the climate system is very dynamic and complex, and I think we don't like to really answer like why would this be more gradual than say like I mean there's pretty clear evidence in Greenland that it was like very fast. To like give a really confident answer on like why there's that difference is challenging because basically you need like some really high performance climate models and more data than we currently have in order to really be able to test that. Um, but I think like the implication is that either that New England responds to the ocean circulation differently. One thing that's been proposed is that maybe so the circulation kind of like goes up the coast of Africa up to Europe and it sinks around Greenland and it brings warm water up there and then it brings cold water sort of more down this way. But there are some eddies that get produced and it might be linked to that. Essentially, these sort of like secondary ocean circulation patterns might have a bigger influence than here. The one thing that's like different than today, for example, that might be interesting for people is like because the same ocean circulation is slowing down as the Greenland ice sheet melts. Um, is that there used to be an ice sheet like right here, so it's unclear like maybe the ice sheet had it had an influence on temperature that you wouldn't have observed like in the ocean, or Greenland was all covered in ice anyways, so maybe it wouldn't really matter. There's also like atmospheric circulation, like the jet stream, and so like to piece what happened from just two sites is a little tricky. But I think the biggest implication is hopefully this will like help people generate some hypotheses about similarities and differences between the climate of New England and like the rest of this region that it's sort of like traditionally just been like linked to. Because like I think before this research, the overall um, consensus was sort of that like what happens in Greenland happens to a lesser extent in like all these other places around the Atlantic, and this looks a little bit different. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your
Can you say who you are?
Oh, sorry. I'm Anne. I'm also in the Earth and Planetary Sciences department. And yeah. Um, so it seems like from this plot, at least, there's sort of a lot more variability
Mm-hmm.
in New England than in like the, you know. Oh, I see. Never mind. I take it back. I was interpreting this totally wrong.
Sorry, I had to go through it quickly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so the the kind of like short-term variability. So it's like a long-term trend, but there's sort of short-term variability
Yeah.
there. Is that similar to short-term variability that we see also in Greenland, or is it sort of unclear because like proxy method?
It's probably a little bit of both. Yeah, I mean, in this field, like it's very rare that you get a super well behaved proxy that just like does exactly what you expect it to do all the time. Yeah, there are definitely like a couple of samples, especially in the sort of like later time periods that are unusually cold. Um, I don't really know exactly why those are. I mean, so these uh these guys they do respond to like things other than temperature. Temperature is like the dominant control in their distribution, but like if the lake water quality rapidly degrades or they lose their food source or something like that, then that will also impact them. Um, so it's possible that there might have been some like ecological changes that are really hard to track that might have been influencing their distributions for a few of these samples. I think it's the fact that we have like two lakes that are close to each other but distinct, and show like a very similar trend overall is like probably suggests that it's climate related for the most part. But yeah. Oh, and then the Greenland part. In Greenland, uh, they these isotopes that they measure are also they have a bit more consistency, I'd say, but as you can see, like they do have quite a bit of variability as well. And I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that this is only temperature. What controls water isotopes is rather complicated, but yeah. Yeah.
I'm Garrett. I'm civil engineering. You mentioned something about pollen record.
Yeah.
I might have missed it, but what's the difference between your record from flies and the record from the pollen?
Yeah. So the long and short of it is that the pollen, the data that we get from pollen, actually, I didn't show it, but they actually do look something like this. But one of the people who compiled the main pollen like temperature reconstructions over this time period is one of my collaborators, and he, before seeing this, he thought it was BS, and now because he thought it was just solely just tracking the trends of atmospheric CO2 levels, but it turns out now we have like two independent methods that show the same thing as his pollen trends. But pollen, so it literally just tells you like what plants are near the lake, because it's however pollen can get into lake sediment. So usually it's like windblown, and it tends to be seen as local, but the wind can blow pollen really far. So one of the drawbacks of pollen potentially is that if you look at pollen at one site, it might be giving you like a really big regional signal instead of like a really local signal about like the climate environment. And then the other thing to know about pollen is like the trees respond to temperature, but they also care about the soil conditions. They care about like how much water is in the soil. They care about precipitation. They care about what season the precipitation falls in. Like there's all these factors that also control the distribution of vegetation beyond just like temperature. And so we're hoping that we were able to find some, generate records that are more specifically just responding to temperature than like all the different things that influence like the distribution of a tree species or something.
Close to the present, they also respond to things like deforestation.
Totally.
So they're used a lot in like pre-historical document areas to track rates of deforestation.
Yeah. People also look for charcoal in lake sediments, and so like during periods of high fire, I would also suspect that like looking at pollen might be a bit misleading about climate conditions too, because it might just be responding to like landscape sort of things that are happening there. Yeah.
I was curious on like your flies. Where are they found? Are they found in the banks? Where do you guys find them?
Yeah. This at the very beginning, this is a picture of us collecting some of these cores from a drone. So we go to the deepest part of the lake. So the first thing we do when we show up to a lake is in the little boat on the left. Someone goes out with a measuring stick with a big disc on it and just goes around and drops it and tries to find the deepest part of the lake for a few hours. And the reason for that is that that's the part of the lake that is most likely to sort of just like accumulate the most amount of sediment and be like the least disturbed by like, if you had like a landslide into the lake, it might impact the sides more than it would impact the middle. So we try to get like the most representative sample of the lake, and typically the standard of the field is to go to the deepest point. Yeah. Yeah, they live at the bottom, and then they like float up, and then they like stop being aquatic and start being terrestrial. It's very bizarre. Yeah. They look pretty similar. I won't lie, like my expertise is like definitely more in the realm of just like this, what like the climatic implications they have. So I don't know a ton about like their ecology beyond sort of like what impacts their distribution. Yeah. Awesome, thank you.
We started off very historical, and now we're moving on to more recent times. And we actually have Alexa, who is not a Northwestern student. Because her research is so recent, she is working here and living here because her work has to do with Lake Michigan. So we're transitioning. Things like grade and Oh yeah. Well, Alexa, I'll let
Okay.
you introduce
Oh.
yourself.
Okay, great. Wait, how do I go like forward back? Okay, great.
But just before you
Oh, no.
start, we are happy to say that we are composting at our events now. So that means the plates you're eating on, any leftover food, feel free to throw that into the composter. I'm not sure about the chopsticks. So everyone wants to. Oh, sweet. Love to hear that. Yeah, so like the sriracha packets, soy sauce packets, keep those to the trash. But everything else, besides the cans as well.
Utensils?
Utensils are good.
Recycling.
Recyclable. Yeah, there's recycling right next to it.
Yeah, recycle your cans.
Oh, but the cutlery is
But
compostable.
compost your cutlery.
Yeah.
And that was brought to us by Capture Compost. So if you guys have your own event, I recommend.
My name is Alexa. I don't actually go to Northwestern, but I am a PhD student and I study hydrology at Colorado School of Mines, which you might be wondering, that's kind of random. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in Evanston. I went to ETHS. I have been around Northwestern's campus quite a bit. I went out to grad school in Colorado, did a master's, started a PhD program. One thing led to another, and for many reasons, I wanted to move back and be closer to friends and family here. So I did that recently, and now I'm working on my PhD remotely. But funnily enough, my PhD is on Great Lakes waves, which is like kind of a funny story of how I got there. But anyway, long story short, it works out great because now I live where I do my research, and I can, do my degree from anywhere. So I'm part of the Surface Hydrodynamics lab at Mines, and we all in that lab do surface water related research about the dynamics of it, how it moves, and how it behaves in that sense. So my research is on waves in the Great Lakes, and specifically Lake Michigan. And today I'm going to be talking about an observational gap that we have in our high frequency water level fluctuation observations. So when we're talking about waves, we're looking at a spectrum. And on the right side are high frequency waves. And so these are waves that if you were standing at the beach, these are the waves that are crashing in every few seconds. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have low frequency waves. These are things like tides. Tides are a thing on the Great Lakes. There are also something called seiche, which is a standing wave that oscillates kind of like this, as in it doesn't propagate and move. It sort of just sits there and kind of like a bathtub sloshing back and forth. And in Lake Michigan, we're primarily talking about two axes that a seiche could oscillate on. One is north to south, and one is west to east. And on the north to south axis, that might be about a 9-hour period, and west to east, that's about like a 3-hour period. But all of these are considered like lower frequency waves, which is like lower than what, higher than what, but like that's sort of the language that we use. And so you won't see these types of waves as like washing onto shore the way you would see wind waves. This is an example of like a seiche where the water is like into an area, and then over time you might see it retreat and then look like the bottom part, and then over time it will come up again. You might think it looks kind of like a tide, but it isn't. It's a seiche. But in the middle here, we actually have an observational gap where we can't see the waves in that band, which is a problem because they include really important waves. And so one example of this is a meteotsunami. Has anyone heard of that before? Okay, great. So it's a tsunami-like wave that happens on the Great Lakes. Tsunamis are caused by tectonic plate movement, but these are caused by atmospheric disturbances. So we're talking about a pressure difference that causes like water on this side to kind of go up, and then it causes a wave to sort of move with a storm system. And this is an example of a beach that was flooded by a meteotsunami, because these can cause water to rush into beaches and communities very, very fast in a matter of hours. and they can cause very hazardous conditions. Another type of wave in this band is called an infragravity wave, which is sort of wind waves that get out of phase with each other. And all of these are really important, not only because they themselves as waves can be hazardous, but they can cause other hazards that we don't observe with water level measurements, such as a rip current. A rip current is obviously very dangerous, but we're not going to be able to see that. Even if we can see this whole spectrum, we're not going to be able to see a rip current event because it's not like a matter of water level moving up and down. And we're still learning a lot about what causes a rip current and how the prevalence of a meteotsunami and a rip current form together, what causes that to happen. But in order to know that, we need to be able to observe this gap. So that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. It's how we're using some of the many ways that we can observe the water to fill the gap. So on the left here, we have what I call like established buoys. These are probably what you would first imagine when you think of like a weather buoy. They're usually can be quite big, which is why the next one over is a spotter buoy. And these are about basketball sized buoys that are lightweight, easy to deploy, relatively inexpensive. And this is kind of a new development that could make water level observations a lot more accessible to communities. The other fun thing about these is that it has what we call a smart mooring, which means that we can sort of DIY the mooring going down to the bottom of the lake with whatever we want to know about. So you could add an ADCP to measure currents, you could add a temperature sensor. In our case, we've added a pressure sensor at the very bottom. And by measuring the pressure at the bottom of the lake, we're measuring like the amount of pressure caused by the water above it. And that is directly related to the waves that are above it. And then next one over is a microwave radar sensor. These are using like a radar to shoot down to the surface of the water, and then we can measure the distance between the sensor and the water and get height. And then the last one are stilling well stations. NOAA has a bunch of stilling wells around the Great Lakes. There's one in Calumet Harbor in Chicago. And these are like permanent structures that are on the shore. So I want to highlight these two observation networks, the microwave radar sensor and the pressure sensor, because these are what is going to close the gap. And it's going to do that by, we're going to increase the sampling frequency. And the reason that this is going to help us close the gap is because of something called the Nyquist theorem, which is basically saying that the frequency that we're taking samples needs to be greater than 2 times the frequency that we want to observe, which is, you can sort of see it a little bit better like this. Like if we want to observe a wave like this, we need at least these 3 observations to construct the wave. Obviously, we want way more than that, but the idea is that this is like the absolute minimum we need. So the sampling frequency is really important to what we can observe. So I want to show some examples of increasing the sampling frequency and how that changes our observations. This is going to be from the microwave radar sensor and the stilling well that are located in Holland, Michigan, which is on the east side of Lake Michigan. And this is during a storm event over the past summer, where like you can see on the radar that like a squall moved over the lake and caused a lot of waves. So the stilling well will sample at 6-minute intervals, and the microwave radar sensor is measuring at 1 hertz, which means 1 sample per second. So there's quite a big difference there. So let's compare. First, we have the stilling well, and you can definitely see that it's picking up an event happening. You can see that there's an increase in the amplitude of our observations. But this is a microwave radar sensor. There's so much more that we can see here, so much so that it's like too dense to even like really tell much from this plot. We'd have to like dig in there and see what exactly is happening to get a better sense of that. But this is the gap. Like we are observing the gap that I just showed you. We were previously unable to see. So that's pretty cool. Just to wrap up, like now that we have this gap filled, what happens next? So one of the things that I'm currently doing is analyzing way more storm events. We had a network of 7 spotter buoys and a couple radar sensors in Lake Michigan this past summer. And so we have lots of data, lots of events that happened over the summer. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, we need to kind of pick through what kind of waves are present that we observed, what was on the bottom there's some meteorology, what was happening weather-wise, to kind of paint a picture of like what's going on here. We're also talking to community leaders and weather professionals as part of an end user advisory group. And here's some examples of those locations to get a sense of what they care about in terms of a beach weather statement out to their community in terms of what the community sees as their biggest hazards. And then we also are doing some 3D hydrodynamic modeling. This is an example from a model called Schism. And those are water levels being modeled on the right. And so we will like force a storm on the model, see what the water levels show and compare that to what we have observed. And the idea here is that we want to know if we can forecast or predict hazardous wave events. So all this is to ultimately make our Great Lakes coastline safer and learn more about the hazards that people living around the coast experience. So thank you so much for having me.
I just want to say that, Alexa, although you are at Colorado, you're also here.
Oh, thank you.
Community, and we all want you to feel very welcome. I know like nothing about waves, but we can support you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I'm Aaron Packman. I'm the other co-director, and I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering. I was wondering how many of these sensors you have deployed through the winter, and how many you can only deploy.
That's a really good question. So short answer is there's someone in my lab group that's actually doing winter wave observation work. But the short answer is that all of these spotters were taken out for the winter. With the exception of, there was one, I can't remember which one it is, but there was one that was, the pressure sensor was left out, but the spotter itself was taken because the ice would form and then it would probably get like choked out anyway. But we're gonna see what the pressure data looks like. And maybe it will be cool, I don't know. But yeah, generally it's like very seasonal.
So my understanding is that there's generally very little open water data in the Great Lakes in the winter because all the big buoys have to be taken out.
Yeah, exactly. A gap in like,
data. Like a lack of understanding of winter storms that especially affect the side of Lake Michigan.
Pretty substantial, I would say. There is one, off the top of my head, there's one buoy I know that's kind of in the center of Lake Michigan, like sort of this southern basin of Lake Michigan, that I believe is a spotter buoy, and I believe has been out there, is just like kept out there because the ice doesn't form all the way in the middle. But I think like the funding of like who's putting out the buoys can be a big mess. And just the fact that, yeah, like the ice makes it difficult to get out there, makes it difficult, like if there's a problem, to fix it. And yeah, that's definitely like a big area of ongoing research for sure.
This might be a silly question, but if sampling frequency was the issue, why is the issue kind of in the intermediary waves versus like the short frequency waves? You have more knowledge on that.
Yeah. So the buoys themselves, like I'll go back maybe to these slides. So the buoys themselves, like the top part of the buoy is actually what's measuring the wind waves. which is sort of the right side of that frequency spectrum that I showed. And it, to be honest, it's like a bunch of math about why it works, but because it's like bobbing along there, like right at the surface, it's able to pick up those like really, really fast waves. Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. I'm super interested with in the microwave radar sensors. I didn't know we were using measure waves. That's really cool. But I guess my thought with that is probably you need to have them stationed along a coastline. And so you can only measure the wave when it gets to the shore. Is there any, like, are there sort of like satellite technologies that could measure waves closer to the center of the lake or anything like that?
Yes, but it's kind of TBD, like how well it works.
Yeah.
But that's, well, so two thoughts. The first one about the microwave sensors being like at the shore, that's such a good point, and why the spotters are really cool and important, because you can put them offshore. And there is a lot of difference in the waves you observe like a couple miles offshore versus what you observe right at like a structure. And I've done some of the plots that I showed. I also have plots of there's actually a microwave radar sensor at Holland that's like inside of the Stillingwell like house, and the observations you get from those are completely different. I mean, they're not like it's clearly like the same waves, but it's like the amplitudes are like so much different because there's literally a structure there. And the same thing is true for like harbors versus like outshore things. So that's a good point. And then um, there are satellites that can measure waves. The issue is they don't pass over the lake like as much as you'd want. So that can help sometimes, but like whether or not you had a storm and the satellite passed over at exactly the same time that the storm happened is sort of
Are they the polar orbiting ones?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, there have been like, that's something that I do want to look into more. It's just like not as consistent, I guess, as you would hope.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of going off of that, microwave radar or the pressure sensors for rip currents, is there data to show, I guess, which one works better for like, I guess, identifying if rip currents are about to happen? Or
Neither of them will actually be able to tell us the presence of rip currents. A current meter would be able to tell us that, but just like the way that our team deployed these, they don't have current meters on there. And then the other thing would be like I mentioned the end user advisory group. Like if a community told us this storm just happened and we got reports of rip currents or noticed a rip current or something like that. So it's really hard to know if one happened unless there was someone like out there experiencing it. Yeah.
Part of why it's so hard because it's so localized, or
what makes the rip currents? Yeah, partially it's localized. So and this is true for like waves too. I mean, like we might have had a storm that hit in a place that we didn't have a buoy, and then we don't see the storm. So it's a little bit like that. And then it's also there's not very many water level observation points around the Great Lakes, and there's even less, I would wager, current like a current in the water observations. So it's just like really hard to be able to pin down exactly where they're happening. Modeling is trying to help with that too, because we can model rip currents. And so if we can figure out what is causing the rip currents in the model, then maybe that's like some indication of how they're being caused in real life. Yeah, it's a problem. Yeah.
The Stilling Well.
Sorry, who are you and where are you from?
Oh, I'm Hugh Milner. I'm history. Where's the Stilling Well in Holland? I know there's a river outlet there. I think that complicates.
Yeah, so Holland, and then if anyone is familiar with Ludington, which is north of Holland, like also on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, both of those Stilling Wells are within either harbors or like some sort of like you said, there's like sort of like a river outlet situation, which is something to like take into account when you're analyzing the data for sure, because it does change how the waves hit and are observed at those locations. But we still like that data is still valuable. But it's like you have to think kind of about like what the infrastructure was there. Mm-hmm.
One more question. So,
Sorry, who are you and where are you from?
I'm Gwenna Heitkamp. I'm a grad student in energy and sustainability at McCormick. Is there a concern potentially with any storms and the bounce back of waves? So I guess like getting data of kind of the waves going out and then coming back in.
Yes. Okay. I want to show just like everyone kind of see it's sort of in the corner, but that is such a huge concern and such a important part of like when I say we're analyzing a wave event, like we are looking at that, because a meteor tsunami, for example, will bounce and reflect off the shore. So if a storm is coming over the lake like this and it hits maybe Holland or something in there, it will reflect back. And this is actually what happened in Chicago in the 1950s. There was a meteor tsunami that we didn't know it was a meteor tsunami at the time that it happened, but it killed, I think, 7 or 8 people because a storm hit on the east side and bounced to Chicago. It was a beautiful sunny day because the storm had already passed and no one knew that a huge wave had ricocheted off and was coming back towards them. And so people were like in the water and stuff, and it caused a huge wave to crash onto the shore, and people were unaware. And that's happened multiple times, not necessarily to that severity, but especially just like this idea that there could be a hazard, but it's not stormy, so we don't think that there's going to be a hazard. That's like if we're trying to work with how people's brains think, like that doesn't compute to people to like not go to the beach even when it's sunny. And so that's like a really important part of kind of figuring out just like what's going on here. But yeah, there can also be waves that like it hits off here, for example, some of it goes back straight across, and then some of it can also do it's called an edge wave, where it just travels like along the coast, north and south. And again, like same idea, that you wouldn't necessarily know that it was coming. Yeah.
I'm Sophie. I'm an undergraduate. My question was, how long did it take that wave to come back, and then like what would be your goal for how fast this technology, since there's this concern?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. The speed that a wave travels is related to the depth of the body of water. And so off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what it would be for Lake Michigan. But on the order of like hours. Yeah, and then in terms of what we would love to have like a real time, like storm is coming, we see it on the radar like back here, and we have some sort of math that will tell us like the shape of Lake Michigan and the depth of Lake Michigan, like this is gonna cause like a meteor tsunami. We don't have that yet, but that would be like the ideal case. And yeah, did that answer your question? Thank you guys. Did I do something first?
I think you're good, yeah. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both, Aiden and Alexa, for coming and sharing great links. very well planned.
Did you have any
Well, I will encourage all to sign up for the field trip, which, come to the donuts, stay for the science. And we are probably will be welcoming your plus one, so if you want to bring your daughter or your boyfriend, whatever, that's probably going to be fine too. But we look forward to our first field trip our first field trip this year.
Yeah, so we have the field trip coming up in March, and then we also have next month our watering hole is by Dr. Paris Collingsworth, who works with the Sea Grant, and he's going to come and talk about the Sea Grant program looking at dissolved oxygen levels in Lake Michigan. So that is our next watering hole, and then our next Wildcats in Water, which is same time as today, is going to be Mary Beth from Facilities, who is going to come and talk to us about all the water that is needed to power all the research at Northwestern. And so that'll be really interesting to hear how we all use water in different ways at Northwestern, many that we might not even think about. So if you're interested in hearing about that, then definitely come and join us next month as well. Yeah, and then again, if you have been inspired by Aiden and Alexa to present some of the work, you can see we cover a broad range of topics, and so definitely reach out to us, and we'd be happy to highlight your research as well. Yeah, thank you all for coming.